I'm Dane. I'm the ENL coach at Eastwood.
And I'm Anastasia. I'm the ENL coach at Westline.
And I'm Chad Hyatt, the curriculum coach across the district.
So today we're going to bring you guys just some information about differentiating some different things in your class. So it could be, we're talking about differentiating assignments, differentiating assessments, but we're also going to look at like the greater scope and maybe even differentiating the process and the product in your class. So Anastasia and I thought about this PD a few weeks ago, and Chad came to us with some ideas on how to incorporate some of that IB and MYP perspective as well. So he's going to bring a really unique lens to this session. So Anastasia and I are both ENL coaches. Our experiences with English language learners, but we know that a lot of the things, really most of the things that we're going to talk about in regards to EL students are really some of your best practices for teaching all of your students. And so that is definitely the case with this today. Like Chad said, we are recording this. There's a small number of you, so feel free to come off mute if you have any questions. Otherwise, if you feel more comfortable putting something in the chat, feel free to do that as well.
Awesome. So let's start with what we're already doing right now in our classrooms. How are we currently differentiating instruction and assignments? And I see that there's a lot of administrators here, so feel free to even say, like, what are you seeing in teachers' classrooms right now? How are teachers differentiating instruction and assignments when you're conducting walkthroughs and pieces like that as well? So what are we seeing in our schools right now? How are we differentiating? So feel free to speak up or to also write in the chat box. Awesome. So I see Letitia, who is a language and literature teacher, I believe. So differentiating the text and the assessment. Great. So right now, thinking about e-learning, Jennifer is talking about the live sessions. You're probably able to differentiate your instruction when they actually are coming to your live lessons, and also providing student choice. So I'm kind of seeing maybe the process, Jennifer, is kind of what you're differentiating right now. And Letitia, you're talking about kind of differentiating the process a little bit and also the product. Anyone else want to talk about what they're saying? Okay, IXL is a wonderful way to differentiate. So that's kind of differentiating the content with IXL. Okay, anyone else before we move on? Yeah, Alexia is great at filling in those gaps, Jennifer. So that's another way to differentiate content to make sure all students are getting what they need. Okay, so Dane is going to walk us through a kind of an exercise when we're planning and thinking about what might students need when we are presenting a lesson or a text.
Yeah, so, and I think just one thing. Oh,
Dane, you're on mute.
On mute. Yeah, so I think one thing that's going to be important, like to take away from this session, we are doing, I think it's really impossible not to be differentiating a lot for your students right now with e-learning. You know, we're giving them a lot of choice. We're giving them a lot of access to instructional programs that have differentiated content already built into it. So I think, you're going to be able to take what you've learn through this experience into the classroom as well. And then we're also, like everything that we talk about today, I think you'll be able to apply to your at-home learning, but as well as your traditional classroom setting. So, when we're talking about this stuff, think about now, but also think about how you might be able to apply some of this in the future. So we're going to look at a reading passage, and as you read, I want you to think about the following questions. So first, what's difficult about understanding the passage? And then what supports would be helpful for you to have before reading or during reading? And as you're reading, if you're thinking about, why is it difficult or what would be helpful for you, feel free to put that in the chat. Or again, you can just come off mute. We don't have too many people on here, so you've got that ability as well. So again, what's difficult about understanding the passage, and then what supports would be helpful to have before reading. And so here's the passage. So if you want to drop in the chat why this is difficult for you to read, what would be helpful. Yeah, Jennifer, vocab, very challenging. Letitia, would be very helpful to have a word bank. Absolutely. Tracy, a vocal word bank for sure. Jamie Tutton. Pictures, vocab help. Absolutely, Jill. Man, a lot of Eastwood people here. All right, represent. Dictionary, vocabulary. Yep. Pictures. Yeah, you guys are right. Does anybody, before we go to the next page, does anybody have an idea about what this is talking about? Tutton, food recipe, cooking something. Yeah, cooking. Richard. So you guys are definitely the cooks in your house. That is a food or a reading passage that is about cooking. If you were not a home cook, you might not really be able to pull even that little bit of context out of this. That's why something like this, if you had vocab, a lot of you mentioned having the vocabulary, maybe like a glossary of those important terms, that would be very helpful. If you included a title, cooking pasta, I think that would definitely open up the access to understanding that passage, or including some pictures. And so, when thinking about differentiating, this is something, giving a glossary, providing some pictures, highlighting the text features, the title, or other headings in a passage can be really, really helpful for your students to understand what they are reading. If they don't have the background, if they don't have the context, just something as simple as going through the vocab or going through the pictures can really build that background and make the text accessible. This is something, like we've been saying, is going to be helpful for your EL students. But really, this is going to be, that could be super helpful for all of your kids. And so when we're talking about modifying, scaffolding, differentiating activities, I think there's a common misconception that when you differentiate or when you modify, you are making the work easier for your students. And that is not at all what we're telling you to do. I think the most important thing is that you make sure that your students have access to that grade level content. We are not saying we're not saying to lower expectations. All of their assignments, everything that they're doing should be working toward meeting the standards and meeting the grade level expectations. But modifying or adapting an activity that is still on grade level is totally appropriate to meet the needs of your English language learners. Now, Chad is going to talk to us a little bit. Are there any questions about that before we move on? And again, feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat.
No, I agree. I mean, I keep running into this even with NWA screeners with my ENL kids. Just one or two words can really throw them. They just completely miss the question, and it's because they didn't know the word like kindling or birch or very specific content related words.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Last week in our building background activity, or our building background PD, excuse me, we talked a lot about the importance of vocab and just really, really making sure that those key content area vocabulary words are pre-taught and reviewed, because it is, that is a huge, that's a huge reason why we have students struggle with reading.
And like everyone's saying right now, this is great for all students. I mean, it's needed for English learners. It's an accommodation that's on their ILP, but it's a routine that we can do in our classrooms for all students, just pre-teaching 5 of the key vocabulary words before you read a text or start a unit or start a lesson. It's just a great routine to have in your classroom.
And I think that's what I was going to follow up with, is that I think that it's how we present this information. I think it's just kind of how our brains work, in the sense of when you say ENL, that's the department that you're gonna that's what you're gonna put it in as a teacher, instead of an overall rainbow or overall umbrella in the sense for all students. So I think it's important that we present this not just for one department, that we sell it as a overall school piece, that this is what we all must do within our classrooms, for us to then for us to show the consistency of it. I think once you put it in one category, that's what people are going to look at it as, and then we don't get our biggest bang for our buck with this, because we're not applying it to all students who fall in this category as well, not just our ENL students.
I agree with you, Richard. And I think it always helps teachers when they can see an example within their content area. So for example, having teachers share little routines that they're doing. I had a science teacher this year that he's embedding a vocab routine before any time that they take notes. And all students have a vocab routine where they draw a visual and then they put the definition in their own words and come up with a real world example. And this is every single student in his class, and it's part of their note-taking routine. So I think
that's what's powerful.
Yeah.
Is when we can show it in each subject area, like an example, and how we can embed it for something. And I'm talking about a subject, like how do we embed it that it's an example in that subject that a teacher can use multiple times, not just that one time, and then they don't go back to it again. So if we're going to do this, exactly. And I think each area needs a true example, multiple examples of how to embed it. Because you're talking about, like, if you're a 10-year teacher, you're going to look at that and maybe pick that up just like that, compared to a first year, second year teacher who is just trying to really get the grips of their subject matter. And now you're saying, hey, I need to embed this is one more thing. You're going to have to show examples in each subject matter how this can be helpful.
I completely agree, and partner with the teachers and have them believe in it. So, yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Richard.
Yeah, great conversation. I'm going to pass it off to Chad, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about how this applies in the MYP setting, and again, just kind of focusing in on that that tier 1 instruction.
All right, thank you, Dane. And so when we are, establishing a focus, an objective for a lesson, that's when the differentiation starts. When we start thinking about what it is we are trying to teach, I want you to expand your thinking that differentiation does not just live in tier 2 and tier 3 work, but as the examples that were being shared there, especially from Anastasia's example there, this is part of our tier 1 instruction. And so as I think about whatever level of blooms that my objective or that my standards are calling for and what it is I want them to be able to do, I want to start thinking about what differentiation looks like within those areas. So for example, if my task is to look at the remember level here, and I'm going to have students recall facts and basic concepts, then what am I doing to help that recall happen? And so am I starting to think about word banks and vocab lists and such? When I get to understanding of from a Bloom's level, am I starting and wanting kids to be able to explain things? This is where sentence starters or frames would be very beneficial in helping kids start to formulate that ability to offer those explanations. When I go up the levels there to analyze and I see the draw connections as part of this, then perhaps one of my automatic thinking routines here is to do a concept map. And so that students know that when we're looking at how all this starts to connect and all this works together and build off of each other, that becomes a routine that they just start to use as part of their note-taking process on their own, even without us. But if I could build that into my tier 1 instruction, then I'm starting to build the understanding of that tool, as part of a process to help everyone understand. All right, and so then let's look at a specific example. Like here are some social studies standards from 8th grade, I believe. And so, when I see like this first one, explain how federal, state, and local governments are involved in the economy of the United States. Again, I see that there is a relationship that's necessary here. And so maybe a concept map here is going to help me be able to show that relationship. If it wasn't for that connection piece or such here, that I may not have thought about that idea of the concept map. And then also, if I'm going to have them really engage in talking about this, either through the explanation here or analyzing it in the next standard, I got to be thinking about some sentence starters, some conversational moves that I can teach to the students to help them engage and get to the depth of instruction level that I really want them to get. And again, come on down there and you see the word identify, and I start thinking about, identify. Okay, I'm probably going to want a word list, okay, or a bank of words for them to be able to choose from there to help with that process. And then finally, the trace the development. Okay, this sounds like something over time, and so a timeline is something that comes into play to help represent this idea and not just talk about it in a PowerPoint or a presentation of sorts, but help with that documentation of it to build that understanding and that depth of learning there. So with any kind of standard, again, I'm going to look at it from that tier 1 level. How am I going to support all students in having access to this information? And those Bloom's levels and differentiating based upon some of those Bloom's verbs and such really can help with that differentiation piece there. Okay.
Any questions about any of these pieces? So to me, what Chad is really saying here is really thinking about all your students and what they need to what skill you want them to be able to do at the end of your unit or your lesson, and what do you want them to know. And that really obviously is based on the standard. And then from there, you think about what scaffolds do you need for all of them to get there at the end. And a lot of these scaffolds we'll give to all students, and then we can, obviously slowly take them away. But some of them might just be some sentence starters that we put on an anchor chart, or provide all of them with a graphic organizer as well. So I feel like sometimes differentiating can feel very overwhelming for teachers. But I think if we just think about what scaffolds do our students need to reach grade level standards, and come up with a couple manageable ways within the unit and the lesson, I think it can come a little bit easier if we're doing that backwards planning at the beginning. So the next part of our little PD today is we wanted to give you guys some content area examples of assignments that have been adapted. So we're gonna kind of do a virtual gallery walk. I have just given you a link to the Google folder, and I want you to take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to look through these content area examples, and to really think about what these teachers have done. These are all Washington Township examples. Most of them are at the middle level, but there are also some high school examples as well. But really look at what are the teachers doing, what are some of the adaptations that they've made, and then we'll have a conversation from there. Anything else you want to add, Dane or Chad?
Yeah, I think just I think you said this, Anastasia, but just like these are before and after examples. So when you are in the folder, you're going to see 2 examples for each content area. And so the first one, the before, is before any modifications or adaptations have been made. And then the after is after. I think some of these, the teachers have worked with coaches, and then others they've just completed these modifications on their own. So you'll see some really good examples in there.
But these are all from our district.
Mm-hmm. And as you're working, if you want to just include anything in the chat about what you notice, what you see, any takeaways, any reflections, feel free to just put that in the chat.
So you have access to this link, so you're welcome to continue to look at some of these examples, but feel free to share out like some of your noticings. How might you use some of these strategies within your own classroom? And then what are some ideas that you have in the future about differentiating?
So this is Letitia. I just looked at a couple. So I definitely like the idea of the sentence starters and the descriptions that go. So like with each section in an essay. So just reminders of what that section is actually called. I liked in the IAS one how it had the pictures, but it also had important words in bold. And so I definitely think that's something that I can steal, making sure that words that I want the kids to specifically look at, that I put those in bold for them.
Great observation.
I think you mentioned visuals, and I know last Friday when we did this, there was a lot of high school teachers, and they really noticed all the visual support within all these examples. And I like to use the nounproject.com. It's great for secondary visual icons. So regardless if you're teaching, a 12th grade social studies or INS class or language and literature class at the secondary level, you can find icons and visuals that are grade level appropriate. So that is a great go-to resource, and it's free. So I just put that in the chat box. Yeah, color coding can also be very helpful for all of our students, and graphic organizers as well. Yeah, Jennifer, you should definitely try out the Noun Project. And what's,
I have a question from middle school to high school. How much, you mentioned the high school, but how much are they also on board with making these adjustments? So I look at it like this: Are we then setting up our 8th graders as they transition from 8th grade to 9th grade, and then they never see that again? They are not getting those same supports. So then let's just say they get it from 6th grade to 8th grade, from West Lane, Eastwood, and Northview, they get accustomed to having these pieces embedded into their academic courses, and then they get to the high school and they don't see them at all. So now does that, are we continuing that trend? Are we seeing this also from elementary to middle school to high school? I guess that's the question I also have.
And I'll start with that. I think we had a wonderful reception from the high school teachers at the training on Friday. And a lot of these things, the ideas that were being shared, were good reminders for them that this is just part of good instruction and such. And so I'm definitely hopeful, especially in terms of the members that came to the training on Friday. I think, when, the use of like the MYP rubrics and such, and moving from one level to the next. And, and if you really, think about, if it's about moving a child from, a level 1-2 to a level 3-4 or to a level 5-6 or whatever, there is what kind of, if you're constantly thinking about what kind of supports are students going to need in order to be able to move to that level, what without a support, what are they showing me right now? And then what are, and then I can say, okay, what are they missing about this? And, and what do they need in order to move that? And I think keeping the MYP consistent, 6 through 10 and such should help with some of that transition. But I think, everybody is learning and being reminded of what good differentiation instruction can be looked like.
And I just jump in, I think Richard and Chad, that's a great point. And I know just my own elementary age children, they're so much easier for them to memorize words and vocabulary, versus when you get older, it's a little tougher. So yeah, I think that's a great point about having these strategies in the elementary schools too.
And I think, if we think about the way the brain works, the brain is looking for patterns and things like that. And so things like mnemonics and such like that, anytime we can bring those out for students, that's why, when it comes to like order of operations and math is something that sticks with all of us because we can remember the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally stuff and the PIMDOS, all those things that we can start to link things through. Those are playing to the natural ways the brain learns. So I think being reminded of those all across the grade levels and how important some of those things are.
And I just want to add on too, I think a lot of it depends on the class. So we obviously have our sheltered classes, and then we also have our co-taught classes at the high school. So hopefully those teachers are looking at, students' accommodations and then also making the content more accessible to meet the needs of all the students in their classes. But we're hoping that spreads to more than just those classes as well.
Yeah. And even, the aspects that are within our control is, improving the instruction there in the middle years. And so with the middle schools and such. And so the better job that we are doing of laying down this foundation for this background knowledge for it would become by the time they're in high school, the more stronger those connections are for the students to be able to draw on, even as some of those supports may be pulled away.
So Chad, I think you're going to kind of wrap it all up for us.
Yeah, and so, last week we offered a session called "What Makes a Quality Online Lesson PD," and I think several people in this session were there for that. And I just want to, build a connection back to some of that work. And so, depending on like where you are in the process of learning for the brain, we use the Zaretta Hammond's model of ignite, chunk, chew, and review to move the students through the natural learning processes of the brain. And so we want to, ignite learning at the beginning, help them be able to focus in on what's important for a lesson and such. And so when we're in that process, perhaps it is pre-teaching vocabulary, perhaps it is, building out, again, underlining words or color coding or anything like that that could help make some of that aspects important. Learning objectives and things like that help with some of that ignite. Then start thinking about the instruction, okay? And chunking and chewing are two things that kind of go side by side, and oftentimes they're the first two things that kind of go out the window when we're in the midst of teaching. But chunking and what's understandable by the brain, about 7 pieces of information is about all the brain can handle at any one time before the working memory gets overloaded. And so are you, what are you doing to chunk that information? Are you providing the outline or such to such, when you think about, again, from an L&L standpoint, we might be thinking about a chapter that we're reading here or a piece of the writing. Are we giving them some tools to start to map out some of those things? And then the chewing, is a key piece. Are we giving them a chance to really engage in the discussion, the turn and talk and such that really help with that digestion and moving that information from the working memory into the long-term memory? And then ultimately reviewing, as Richard said, about us earlier in our conversation about some of the math, are we really doing a spiral review of sorts with some of the key content and really circling back, because that retrieval practice for the brain is what's most important. If we can just self-quiz ourselves on things to make ourselves bring things back into the working memory to use it and everything, because if we don't use it, we lose it, as you all know. And so then on the same note, as we are digging in with some of these technological tools and such in our current frame, what are we doing in the differentiation in regards to those tools? How are we supporting students? How are we keeping that differentiation in play when we're in the midst of working with some of those tools? And so I think, when it comes to a quality lesson framework, again, that tier 1 instruction, this is the important time to really be focused on the differentiation piece. And I always say that, oftentimes if we are feeling so overloaded with differentiating, is probably because we're thinking of it from a tier 2 and tier 3, and we are trying to differentiate personally for every little kid, and every little aspect that they need, instead of doing some crucial differentiation in the tier 1 that are going to support all students for getting that information. So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind here as you work through this. So, any questions? Any concerns? Comments? And drop those in the chat there, or unmute, since it's a small crowd today.
I just want to say, even though this slide was specifically thinking about online lessons, when we get back into our classrooms, hopefully in the fall, and I feel like we can still use a lot of these resources to kind of think of like a blended learning model. So some students are on the computer, but then you're able to differentiate by process and pull a small group to work on either maybe pre-teaching a concept or to go back and teach again a concept. But I feel like this blended learning model, since we're so much more comfortable using these online platforms, can really support us in the classroom, like differentiating as well.
I was about to say the same thing. Like, I'm looking at it. I took a screenshot of this because I think this is another tool that could be on the forefront for our teachers, like either embedded within the handbook, or near a teacher's desk, that is something that they can consistently go back to and use. Especially when we eventually go back and we're fusing the technology piece that we have now become our norm into what we daily do in front of the classroom. I just think that this is something that is needed for everyone, because it's something that's very easy on the eyes. You can see it, you can use it, and you can repeat it time and time again.
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and again, in the coaches newsletter, we have the presentation for this, and the link is on the YouTube channel that we've been sharing with the PDs and such to that conversation. And so you can see the whole thing with this, but this little snapshot here of just kind of synthesizing it all together, I think it's going to be a very useful tool when we get back, for sure.
Yeah, I know at our building at Wesleyan, a lot of our math teachers are using Edpuzzle, and that's a great resource. So they can pool small groups of students while the rest of the students are on Edpuzzle. So I see all the different things that we can do with this in the future. I'm excited.
So that's everything that we have for you guys.